She said I'd never be worth anything. Then she saw my face on Forbes. You know how they say rock bottom has excellent Wi-Fi? Well, let me tell you about my personal crash landing in 2022 right here in Oklahoma City. The name's David Miller, and if my life was a country song, it would have been banned from the radio for being too depressing. My divorce from Tiffany wasn't just paperwork. Oh no, it was a full-blown reality show, complete with drama, betrayal, and enough lawyer fees to fund a small NASA mission. She took everything. The house with the granite countertops I never wanted. The SUV that guzzled gas like a teenager chugs energy drinks. Even my favorite coffee mug, the one with a chip on the handle that fit my thumb perfectly. But here's the kicker. She left me one thing. One measly, forgotten piece of property that she tossed to me like scraps to a stray dog. Tiffany stood there in her designer heels, keys dangling from her perfectly manicured fingers, wearing that smile that could cut glass. The same smile she used when returning Christmas gifts she didn't like. She dropped those keys into my palm and said something that still echoes in my head. Take your fantasies and your father's weirdness. A pile of junk in the middle of nowhere is all you've got left. At that moment, staring at those rusty keys, I felt like a man who'd just been handed the deed to his own failure. Little did I know, fate has a twisted sense of humor. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're really capable of finding. The property she was talking about, an old storage facility sitting on a patch of Oklahoma dirt that looked like God had forgotten to finish it. Rolling hills stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional oil pump nodding like a mechanical prayer. This wasn't prime real estate. This was the kind of place where tumbleweeds came to retire. The storage facility itself looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Metal siding weathered the color of old pennies, a roof that had seen better decades, and weeds growing tall enough to hide a small car. It belonged to my father, who'd passed away 10 years ago, leaving me with property taxes I'd been paying out of habit and a vague sense of obligation. Dad was one of those guys who could spend 3 hours looking for a screwdriver that was sitting right on his workbench, but somehow spot a rare bird from half a mile away. He had this way of seeing things that nobody else could see, which was probably why I loved him so much and understood him so little. Growing up, I knew Dad was obsessed with Oklahoma's gold rush history. Our house was filled with old maps, dusty books about prospectors, and newspaper clippings about lost treasures that he cut out and filed away like they were classified documents. He'd disappear into his office for hours, surrounded by magnifying glasses and notebooks filled with his cramped handwriting. Whenever I asked what he was working on, he'd ruffle my hair and say it was too serious for kids. Even as an adult, when I'd visit with Tiffany for holidays, Dad would deflect my questions with jokes about treasure hunting being a young man's game. The storage facility was his private sanctuary, his personal Batcave where he conducted what he called his research. I never pushed it. As a mechanical engineer, I was all about concrete solutions to practical problems. Dad's hobby seemed like elaborate daydreaming, the kind of thing that kept retired folks busy between doctor appointments and early bird specials. After he passed, I just kept paying property taxes. I'd simply mail the check every year without thinking about it much. The key to the place had been sitting in my kitchen junk drawer for a decade, in a little envelope marked "Don't Throw Away" in Dad's handwriting. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. But now, standing in my empty apartment with nothing but an air mattress and a sense of profound failure, that storage facility suddenly represented something different. It was my last connection to Dad, and simultaneously, my ticket to finally closing that chapter of my life for good. I decided to drive out there on a gray Tuesday morning in March. The kind of day where the sky looks like it can't decide whether to rain or just sulk. I loaded my truck with trash bags, work gloves, and the kind of industrial-strength coffee that could wake the dead. My plan was simple. Clean out whatever junk Dad had accumulated, sell the property, and use the money to start over somewhere far from the wreckage of my marriage. The drive took me through parts of Oklahoma I'd forgotten existed. Small towns with names like Wellston and Chandler, where the main street consists of a gas station, a Dollar General, and a diner that's been serving the same meatloaf since the Clinton administration. This was America's heartland in all its stubborn, weathered glory. When I finally reached Dad's property, I sat in my truck for a solid 10 minutes, just staring. The storage facility looked even worse than I remembered from my one brief visit years ago. The padlock on the main door was so rusted, I wasn't sure my key would even work. Weeds had grown up around the building like nature was trying to reclaim it one dandelion at a time. But as I walked around the perimeter, something caught my attention. This wasn't just some thrown-together metal shed. Dad had reinforced the walls, added extra insulation, and installed what looked like a pretty sophisticated ventilation system. For a guy storing farm junk, he sure had gone to a lot of trouble. The lock finally gave way after some WD-40 and creative cursing. The door swung open with a groan that sounded like the building itself was waking up from a long nap. What I saw inside made me stop dead in my tracks. This wasn't the same place I remembered. Growing up, I'd been here maybe 3 or 4 times with Dad when he needed to grab tools or store equipment. Back then, it was exactly what you'd expect. A cluttered mess of farming junk, old machinery parts, and boxes stacked everywhere with no apparent system. I remembered thinking it was just Dad being Dad, accumulating stuff he'd never actually use. But this was completely different. This was a research laboratory. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with meticulous handwriting. Maps covered every available surface, not just Oklahoma, but territories across the American West. There were geological surveys, railroad construction documents, and what looked like original surveyor's notes from the 1800s. He must have transformed this place during his final years, probably after I'd stopped visiting regularly when Tiffany and I got serious. While I was busy building my career and planning my wedding, Dad had been quietly turning his storage shed into something extraordinary. No wonder he'd always been vague about what he kept out here. This wasn't random junk storage anymore. Dad had organized everything with the precision of a librarian and the passion of a detective. Magnifying glasses, measuring tools, and photography equipment sat arranged on workbenches like surgical instruments. This was the workshop of a man who took his obsession very, very seriously. I spent the first hour just walking around, trying to process what I was seeing. Every newspaper clipping I remember from our house was here, along with hundreds more. Stories about lost mines, disappeared prospectors, and legendary treasure caches that captured Dad's imagination for decades. At first, I'll be honest, I was ready to just haul everything to the dumpster. But then I started actually looking at what he'd collected. These weren't random clippings and amateur theories. Dad had been corresponding with historians, archaeologists, and other researchers from across the country. Letters dating back 20 years showed a network of people with PhDs and museum positions who treated him as a peer, not a hobbyist. Even though I'd always considered his treasure hunting a bit eccentric, I had to admit something was clicking. Maybe it was my engineering background, but I could see the systematic approach he'd taken. Every file was cross-referenced. Every theory was backed up with multiple sources. And growing up around his explanations of geological formations and historical patterns had apparently stuck with me more than I'd realized. One file drawer was labeled simply, Gold Rush Research, Personal Project. Inside were dozens of folders organized by topic, geological surveys, historical accounts, newspaper archives, and what appeared to be Dad's own field notes spanning decades. The scope of his research was incredible. As afternoon faded into evening, I kept digging through Dad's files. The deeper I went, the more impressed I became. This man I thought was chasing fantasies had actually been conducting serious historical research. He'd identified inconsistencies in official records, tracked down descendants of original prospectors, and even conducted his own geological surveys of potential sites. But something was bothering me. If Dad had been this thorough, this dedicated, for so many years, what exactly had he been searching for? And more importantly, what had he found? That's when I noticed something odd about the wooden floor in the back corner of the facility. The boards didn't quite line up with the rest of the flooring. When I knelt down for a closer look, I could see that this section had been carefully cut and reinstalled. Dad, being the meticulous guy he was, had built some kind of hidden compartment. It took me 20 minutes and a crowbar from Dad's tool collection to pry up the boards. My heart was pounding as I worked, partly from exertion and partly from anticipation. What could be so important that Dad had gone to these lengths to hide it? Underneath, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and cloth, was a metal box about the size of a briefcase. My hands were actually shaking as I lifted it out. The weight suggested it was full of something substantial. Inside the box, nestled in careful organization, were items that made my breath catch. Dad's personal journals, leather-bound and filled with his familiar handwriting. Photographs of locations across Oklahoma, each carefully labeled with coordinates and notes. And there, wrapped in what looked like acid-free tissue paper, was something that made my engineer's brain struggle to process what I was seeing. It was an old, hand-drawn map, not a photocopy or reproduction, but what appeared to be an original document, aged to a golden brown color that spoke of genuine age. The paper felt different under my fingers, thicker, more substantial than modern paper. This was something that had survived a very long time. The level of detail was incredible. Every line had been drawn with artistic precision. Symbols and markings covered the surface in patterns that clearly meant something important, even though I couldn't immediately understand what. This wasn't just any old map. This was something special, something that Dad had considered valuable enough to hide away like a treasure itself. Sitting there in that dusty storage facility as darkness fell outside, surrounded by the life's work of a man I was only beginning to understand, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of purpose, a mystery that needed solving, and the growing realization that maybe Dad hadn't been chasing fantasies after all. I carefully packed everything back into the metal box, my mind racing with questions. What was this map? Why had Dad hidden it so carefully? And what secrets might it contain that had captured his attention for so many years? As I locked up the storage facility and drove home through the Oklahoma night, one thought kept echoing in my head. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's a chance to understand someone you love in a completely new way and maybe finish something important they had to leave undone. I had no idea that night how dramatically my life was about to change. All I knew was that for the first time since my marriage fell apart, I felt genuinely excited about tomorrow. And that feeling, combined with a mysterious map waiting in that metal box, was about to lead me on an adventure I never could have imagined. That night, I spread everything out on my kitchen table like I was planning to invade a small country. Dad's journals, the mysterious map, photographs with coordinates that looked like they belonged in a GPS manual from Mars. And me, sitting there with a cup of gas station coffee that could strip paint, try and make sense of what felt like the world's most elaborate puzzle. At first glance, it looked like madness, but as I kept reading, a pattern emerged, like something just out of reach was waiting to be understood. Dad hadn't just been collecting random historical documents. He'd been building something, piece by careful piece, for years. The more I read through Dad's journals, the more I realized I was looking at something way beyond weekend treasure hunting. This wasn't some guy with a metal detector and a dream. Dad had been conducting legitimate historical research, and the map he'd found was apparently connected to one of Oklahoma's most enduring mysteries. From what I could piece together from his notes, this wasn't just any old treasure map. It was connected to something called the Leonardo map, named after a gold prospector from the 1890s, who went by Leo McGregor. Dad had spent decades trying to decode what Leo had left behind, and the deeper I dug into his research, the more I understood why it had taken him so long. I'll be honest, half of Dad's notes looked like they required 3 graduate degrees to decipher. This map was like a puzzle designed by someone who thought regular puzzles were for amateurs. Dad had identified at least 4 different layers of complexity, and each one made my head spin. First, there were astronomical markers that changed depending on the season. Apparently, Leo had used star positions that were only accurate at specific times of year. Try explaining that to your average treasure hunter with a shovel and some free time. Dad had pages of calculations about celestial navigation that looked like they belonged in a NASA mission briefing. Then there were geological markers that required knowledge of rare mineral formations and soil composition. Dad had pages of notes about things like ferruginous sandstone deposits and quartz vein patterns that made my engineering degree feel like finger painting. He'd even collected soil samples from dozens of locations, trying to match them to descriptions on the map. But the real kicker was the linguistic component. Parts of the map contained what Dad believed were coded messages based on Native American dialects that had largely disappeared from common use. He'd been corresponding with linguists and tribal historians for years, trying to decode phrases that might hold the key to the whole thing. As I sifted through layer after layer of notes, it hit me. Dad hadn't just been chasing treasure. He'd built a system, a theory, a life's work that needed one last missing link. But even with all his research, all his dedication, he'd been missing one crucial element, the kind of modern technology that could tie all these clues together. Reading his final entries, I could see the frustration building. He'd gotten close, really close, but couldn't quite make that final connection. It was like watching someone try to solve a Rubik's Cube while wearing oven mitts. All the pieces were there, but he just couldn't manipulate them in the right way. That's when I realized something important. Maybe I couldn't solve this alone, but I had advantages Dad didn't have. GPS technology, satellite imaging, the internet, where you can find an expert on anything from ancient linguistics to soil composition at 3 a.m, and most importantly, I had Dad's research as a foundation. But I also knew I was going to need help from someone who understood the historical and academic side of this puzzle. Someone who could fill in the gaps where my engineering brain hit a wall. That's when I remembered something from Dad's correspondence files. Letters from a Dr. Evelyn Grant at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Grant was apparently some kind of big deal in Oklahoma archaeological circles. Dad had been writing to her for years, sharing theories and asking for her input on various historical questions. From what I could tell, she'd been one of the few academics who took his research seriously instead of dismissing him as just another treasure hunter with wild theories. Calling her felt like the adult equivalent of asking your teacher if you can stay after class to discuss your science project. I spent a good 10 minutes staring at my phone, trying to figure out how to explain that I'd inherited what might be the most significant historical puzzle in Oklahoma without sounding like a complete lunatic. When I finally dialed her number, a woman answered with the kind of voice that suggested she was used to fielding calls from graduate students having nervous breakdowns. I started my pitch with something smooth like, "Hey, you probably don't remember me, but my father was David Miller, and he used to write to you about treasure maps." There was a pause that lasted just long enough for me to start planning my backup career as a Walmart greeter. Then she said something that almost made me drop the phone. She'd been wondering when I was going to call. Apparently, Dad had mentioned me in his letters over the years, and she'd been curious about what would happen to his research after he passed away. Dr. Grant agreed to meet me the next day at her office on campus. I spent that evening trying to organize Dad materials into something that wouldn't make me look like a conspiracy theorist with a filing cabinet addiction. Maps, journals, correspondence, soil samples. I loaded everything into my truck, like I was moving to a new state. The University of Oklahoma campus looked exactly like every college campus in America, red brick buildings, students who appear to be roughly 12 years old, and parking that costs more per hour than most people make in a day. I found Dr. Grant's office in the history department, which smelled like old books and academic ambition. Dr. Evelyn Grant turned out to be nothing like what I'd expected. I'd been picturing some dusty professor type with thick glasses and a cardigan collection. Instead, I met a woman who looked like she could lead an archaeological expedition and then write the definitive paper about it. Professional but approachable, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your stuff. She looked through Dad's materials with the focus of someone examining evidence in a criminal case. Every few minutes, she'd make a small sound of surprise or approval, like she was reading a really good mystery novel. When she got to the map itself, she went completely quiet for about 5 minutes. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She told me that what Dad had found was potentially one of the most significant historical documents related to Oklahoma's territorial period. The Leonardo map had been a legend in archaeological circles for decades, but most people assumed it was either lost forever or had never really existed in the first place. Dr. Grant explained that Leo McGregor had been unusual among gold prospectors. Most treasure hunters of that era were focused on quick strikes and immediate profits. Leo, apparently, had been different. He'd had formal surveying training and had approached gold hunting like a science project. His maps were supposedly works of art as much as practical tools. But here's where things got interesting. Dr. Grant had been researching Leo McGregor herself for years, approaching it from a historical rather than treasure-hunting perspective. She'd found records suggesting that Leo hadn't just been looking for gold. He'd been documenting something much more significant about the geological and cultural history of the territory. As we spread Dad's research across her office, something clicked. She had pieces of the puzzle that Dad had been missing, and Dad had research that filled gaps in her own work. It was like watching two halves of a machine finally connect. We were living an academic thriller movie, and somehow I'd gotten cast as the lead. We spent the next several hours going through everything systematically. Dr. Grant could read the Native American linguistic elements that had stumped Dad for years. I could interpret some of the more technical geological references that she'd found challenging. And together, we started to see patterns that neither of us had been able to identify alone. The astronomical markers that Dad had been struggling with made perfect sense when Dr. Grant showed me how to calculate historical star positions using modern software. The geological references started coming together when I explained some of the soil analysis techniques Dad had been using. It was like watching a blurry photograph slowly come into focus. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Grant noticed something about Dad's organizational system. He'd been filing certain documents together in a way that suggested he'd found connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. She started pulling files that Dad had cross-referenced, looking for patterns. That's when we found it, tucked into one of Dad's journals, being used as a bookmark like it was just another piece of paper, was a coin. Not just any coin, but what appeared to be a very old, very rare piece that Dr. Grant immediately recognized as significant. The coin was dated 1893, the same year as the map, but more importantly, it had markings that matched symbols we'd been seeing throughout Leo McGregor's documentation. Dr. Grant examined it under a magnifying glass while I watched, feeling like we were in some kind of archaeological detective story. She started getting excited in the way that academics do when they discover something that's going to make their colleagues very jealous. The coin wasn't just a bookmark. It was another piece of Leo's puzzle. The markings on it corresponded to specific locations on the map, and when we cross-referenced them with Dad's research, we suddenly had coordinates that pointed to a very specific area. An area that Dad had actually visited multiple times, according to his notes, but had never fully explored. An area that contained what appeared to be the remnants of old mining operations, including at least one entrance to underground workings that had been sealed or camouflaged sometime in the past century. As evening turned into night in Dr. Grant's office, surrounded by maps and journals and the growing excitement of a puzzle finally coming together, I realized something unexpected was happening. This wasn't just about solving Dad's mystery anymore. Somewhere between decoding astronomical calculations and arguing about soil composition, I started really enjoying working with Dr. Grant. She was brilliant in a way that made complex problems seem manageable. She approached everything with the kind of methodical thinking that appealed to my engineering background, but she also had an intuitive understanding of historical patterns that I found fascinating. More importantly, she understood what this research had meant to Dad. She didn't see him as just another amateur treasure hunter. She recognized the quality of his work and the significance of what he'd been trying to accomplish. That meant more to me than I'd expected it to. After months of feeling like everything in my life had been a mistake, working with someone who respected Dad's dedication felt like finding solid ground again. By the time we'd organized everything and identified our next steps, it was past midnight. Dr. Grant suggested we continue the work the next day, but as I was packing up Dad's materials, I couldn't help feeling like we were on the verge of something extraordinary. The coin had given us coordinates that were more precise than anything Dad had worked with. We had access to technology and resources that he'd never had. And most importantly, we had the complete picture of Leo McGregor's puzzle for the first time in over a century. Driving home through the empty Oklahoma streets, I couldn't stop thinking about how Dad would have reacted to see his research finally coming together. He'd been so close to solving something that had fascinated him for decades, and now, with Dr. Grant's help, We were about to finish what he'd started. But there was something else I couldn't stop thinking about. The way Dr. Grant had looked at the map and Dad's research with genuine appreciation for the work involved. The way she'd immediately grasped connections that had taken Dad years to develop. The way working with her had felt natural and exciting in a way I hadn't experienced since before my marriage fell apart. Sometimes the best partnerships come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes you find exactly what you need when you're looking for something completely different. And sometimes the person who can help you solve an old mystery turns out to be someone who might also help you solve some new ones. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that tomorrow we'd be taking the next step toward actually finding Leo McGregor's legendary cache. We had the map, we had the research, and now we had the final piece of the puzzle that Dad had been using as a bookmark for who knows how long. The coordinates pointed to a specific location, an old mining area that had been abandoned for decades. According to our research, there was a concealed entrance to underground workings that Leo had apparently used as his final hiding place. Tomorrow, Dr. Grant and I would be heading out there to see if we could finish what Dad had started over 20 years ago. The next morning, I met Dr. Grant at a sporting goods store that looked like it could outfit a small army. We were loading up on equipment that I never thought I'd need outside of a disaster movie. Helmets with headlamps, rope, safety harnesses, and something called a ground-penetrating radar unit that cost more than my first car. Standing there in the camping section, surrounded by gear designed for people braver than I felt, I had to laugh at the irony. 6 months ago, after my divorce, I thought the biggest risk I'd ever take again would be choosing between 2 flavors of ice cream at the grocery store. Now here I was, preparing to descend into an abandoned mine shaft that hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. Dr. Grant was in full expedition mode, checking and double-checking everything with precision of someone who clearly knew what she was doing. She'd done this kind of field work before, while my most dangerous professional experience had been climbing a ladder to check HVAC systems. But there was something about the way she approached the planning that made me feel more confident about the whole crazy enterprise. We spent 2 days preparing, and I have to admit, the engineer in me loved a methodical approach. We studied satellite images of the area, cross-referenced them with Dad's notes, and plotted out multiple access routes. The location was about 40 miles outside Oklahoma City, in an area that had been mined for gold and silver during the territorial period, but had been abandoned for decades. The ground-penetrating radar was a key piece of equipment that explained why Leo's cache had remained hidden for over a century. This technology could detect underground cavities and metal deposits that would be impossible to find any other way. Dad had been working with maps and intuition, but we had science on our side. On the morning we set out, Oklahoma was showing off with one of those perfect spring days that makes you remember why people choose to live in Tornado Alley despite the occasional flying barn. Clear skies, temperature in the 70s, and a breeze that carried the smell of fresh earth and possibility. The drive to the location took us through countryside that looked like a postcard advertising the American heartland. Rolling hills covered in new grass, cattle that looked up from their breakfast to watch us pass, and farmhouses that had been standing since before Oklahoma was even a state. It was beautiful in that understated way that doesn't make the travel brochures, but somehow gets into your soul. When we reached the coordinates from the coin, we found ourselves in an area that looked like nature had been trying to erase any evidence of human activity. What had once been mining operations were now just subtle depressions in the landscape, overgrown with trees and brush that had decades to reclaim the territory. But when Dr. Grant fired up the ground-penetrating radar and started scanning the area, the hidden history revealed itself like invisible ink under a blacklight. Underground, there was a whole network of passages and chambers that had been completely invisible from the surface. Leo McGregor had chosen his hiding spot well. We found the entrance exactly where the map and coin had indicated it would be. It was so well camouflaged that you could walk past it a dozen times without noticing, just what looked like a natural depression in a hillside, covered with decades of fallen leaves and overgrown vegetation. When we cleared away the debris, we found an opening that had been carefully sealed with stones that matched the surrounding rock formation. Someone, presumably Leo himself, had gone to considerable trouble to make sure this entrance would remain hidden. The engineering was actually impressive, in an old-fashioned, analog kind of way. Standing at the mouth of that tunnel, looking into darkness that seemed to go on forever, I felt my confidence starting to wobble like a table with one short leg. This was real. We were really going to crawl into a hole in the ground that had been sealed for over 100 years, following clues left by a man who might have been brilliant or might have been completely insane. Dr. Grant must have sensed my hesitation, because she did something that surprised me. She admitted she was nervous too. She'd done plenty of archaeological work, but most of it involved carefully excavating sites with teams of graduate students and safety protocols. This was more like an episode of those adventure shows where people rappel into caves and occasionally don't come back out. But we were too close to turn back now. We'd solved Dad's puzzle, we had a location, and we had the equipment. More importantly, we had each other. Sometimes in life, you reach a point where the only way forward is through something that scares the hell out of you. This was one of those moments. The initial descent was easier than I'd expected. The tunnel was narrow but stable, carved through limestone that had held its shape for more than a century. Our headlamps cut through the darkness, revealing walls that showed evidence of careful excavation rather than hasty digging. Leo McGregor had known what he was doing. About 50 feet in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that felt like stepping into an underground cathedral. The air was cool and still, carrying that musty smell of places where time moves differently. Our lights revealed a space that was surprisingly sophisticated, not just a cave, but an engineered structure with support beams and drainage channels. That's when we hit our first real challenge. The chamber had multiple passages leading deeper into the hillside, and none of them were marked on Dad's map. Leo had apparently built himself an underground maze, probably as insurance against anyone who might have followed him down here back in the day. I was studying the passages, trying to figure out which way to go, when Dr. Grant let out a sound that I can only describe as a cross between a scream and the noise you make when you step on a Lego barefoot. I spun around, expecting to see a cave-in or a bottomless pit, and instead found her doing what appeared to be an interpretive dance while pointing at the wall. Spider. A big one. The kind that looks like it's been hitting the gym and taking protein supplements. Dr. Grant, who could discuss the finer points of pre-Columbian pottery without breaking a sweat, had apparently met her match in an 8-legged Oklahoma cave resin who was probably just as surprised to see us as we were to see him. I, being the brave protector and former engineer, immediately jumped backward and nearly dropped the $1,000 radar unit, because apparently my fight-or-flight response doesn't distinguish between actual danger and creepy crawlies that are probably more afraid of me than I am of them. We both started laughing at the same time. Here we were, two allegedly intelligent adults, equipped with high-tech gear, and pursuing a legendary treasure, and we were both terrified of a spider that was probably wondering what these weird giants were doing in his neighborhood. That moment of shared ridiculousness somehow broke the tension that had been building as we went deeper underground. We weren't just researcher and consultant anymore. We were partners in this crazy adventure, complete with the kind of vulnerability that comes from being scared of the same dumb things. Using the radar to scan the different passages, we found evidence of metal deposits in the leftmost tunnel. The readings were strong and consistent with what we'd expect to find if Leo had hidden a significant cache of coins and precious metals. This was it. After more than a century, we were following the footsteps of a long-dead prospector toward his final secret. The passage led us deeper into the hillside, through chambers that showed increasing evidence of careful construction. Leo hadn't just hidden his treasure, he'd built a proper vault. Support timbers that were still solid after all these years. Drainage systems that had kept the chambers dry. This was the work of someone who understood both mining and preservation. 3 hours into our underground expedition, covered in dust and spider webs, we found ourselves in a chamber that was different from all the others. Smaller, more carefully finished, and sealed with a stone wall that had clearly been built to last. This was Leo's inner sanctum, the place where he'd hidden whatever was valuable enough to justify all this elaborate secrecy. Breaking through that wall felt like opening a time capsule. The first thing our lights revealed was a metal container about the size of a large suitcase, sitting on a stone shelf like it had been waiting for us. Next to it was something even more intriguing, a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived more than a century in near-perfect condition. I lifted the container down from its shelf, surprised by how heavy it was. Whatever Leo had hidden here, there was a lot of it. The metal was tarnished but intact, and when I opened the latches, I felt like an archaeologist opening a pharaoh's tomb. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be custom-fitted compartments, were dozens of coins and currency that made my breath catch. Gold double eagles that gleamed in our headlamp beams like they'd been minted yesterday. Silver dollars with dates from the 1880s and 1890s. And most incredibly, Confederate currency that looked like it had never been circulated. Dr. Grant was examining the coins with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for ancient artifacts. Her expertise was in historical documentation, but she knew enough about numismatics to recognize what we were looking at. These weren't just old coins. They were specimens that collectors and museums would consider priceless. The real treasures were the 1933 double eagles. I'd read about these coins in Dad's research. They were among the rarest American coins ever minted, with only a handful known to exist. Most had been melted down when the U.S. went off the gold standard. A single 1933 double eagle had sold at auction for over $7 million just a few years earlier. But it was a Confederate currency that really told the story. These were high-denomination notes from the final years of the Civil War, preserved in condition that most collectors could only dream about. Leo McGregor hadn't just been a successful prospector. He'd been a strategic collector who understood the historical value of what he was preserving. Sitting in that underground chamber, surrounded by treasure that represented more money than I'd ever imagined possessing, I felt something unexpected. The first emotion wasn't excitement or greed. It was sadness. Dad had been so close. He'd solved most of the puzzle. He'd identified the location. He'd spent years preparing for this moment. I found myself wishing desperately that Dad could be there to see what we'd found. This wasn't just about money. It was about completing something he devoted the last 20 years of his life to understanding. The treasure was incredible, but the real discovery was the validation of everything Dad had believed about Leo McGregor and the mystery he'd been trying to solve. Dr. Grant seemed to understand what I was feeling without me having to explain it. She'd spent enough time with Dad's research to appreciate the depth of his commitment and the quality of his work. This discovery wasn't just significant for us. It was a testament to a man who pursued knowledge and truth long after most people would have given up. As we carefully documented everything and prepared to bring the treasure back to the surface, I realized something important. The real value of what we'd found wasn't going to be measured in dollars. It was a completion of a quest that had started with my father's curiosity and ended with proof that sometimes, when you follow the evidence far enough, you really do find what you're looking for. Leo McGregor's cache was everything Dad had hoped it would be, a significant historical discovery that would rewrite what people knew about Oklahoma's territorial period. But more than that, it was evidence of the hours Dad had spent in his makeshift laboratory, the files he'd organized so carefully, the theories he developed so patiently, had all been leading to something real and important. The journey back to the surface felt different than the descent. We were carrying more than just treasure. We were carrying completion of a story that had been waiting over a century to be finished. Dad's story. Leo McGregor's story. And now, somehow, our story, too. Standing in the Oklahoma sunshine, looking at a collection that would probably end up in museums and private collections around the country, I understood something about legacy that I'd never grasped before. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can leave behind isn't money or property. Sometimes it's an unanswered question that gives someone else a reason to keep searching. 2 weeks later, our lives went from zero to Hollywood overnight. Dr. Grant and I had contacted the major auction houses and museums to authenticate our discovery, and apparently, finding a legendary treasure cache that historians have been arguing about for over a century is exactly the kind of story that news producers dream about. The headline on CNN read, "Oklahoma treasure hunters strike gold with historic discovery." Suddenly, the guy who 6 months earlier couldn't even keep his marriage together was being interviewed on national television about what they were calling the most significant historical find in Oklahoma's history. The authentication process had been intense. Teams of experts from Sotheby's, Christie's, and the Smithsonian had descended on Oklahoma like a scholarly invasion force. Every coin, every banknote, every piece of Leo McGregor's collection had been examined, photographed, and certified with the kind of attention usually reserved for moon rocks. Their verdict was unanimous and staggering. The collection was not only authentic, but included pieces that collectors and museums had only dreamed of acquiring. The 1933 double eagles alone were worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Combined with Confederate currency and the other rare coins, we were looking at a discovery valued at over $80 million. $80 million, the kind of number that doesn't feel real when you first hear it. The kind of money that means you never have to worry about anything practical ever again. The kind of financial security that most Americans spend their entire lives hoping for and never achieve. Dr. Grant and I decided to auction about half the collection, keeping the most historically significant pieces for museums and research institutions. The auction at Sotheby's in New York turned into one of those events that makes collectors mortgage their houses and empty their retirement accounts. Bidding wars that lasted hours. Phone calls from private collectors who treated rare coins like other people treat fantasy football. We walked away from that auction with more money than I'd ever imagined possible. Financial independence doesn't even begin to describe it. This was generational wealth, the kind of money that would let us pursue whatever we wanted for the rest of our lives without ever having to worry about practical considerations. But here's the thing about sudden wealth. It has a way of bringing people out of the woodwork. People you haven't heard from in years suddenly remember how close you used to be. Distant relatives discover they've always been interested in your well-being. Investment advisors appear like mushrooms after rain, all eager to help you manage your newfound fortune. The press conference announcing the final sale results was held at the Oklahoma History Center in Oklahoma City. Local media, national news networks, even some international outlets covering what they called a real-life treasure hunt with a Hollywood ending. Dr. Grant and I had prepared statements about the historical significance of the discovery and our plans for the pieces we were donating to museums. I was halfway through explaining the archaeological importance of Leo McGregor's preservation techniques when I saw something that made me literally stop mid-sentence. Standing at the back of the room, wearing what appeared to be a designer outfit that cost more than most cars, was Tiffany, my ex-wife, the woman who had thrown those storage facility keys at me like I was a dog she was tired of feeding. She wasn't alone. Next to her stood a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a financial magazine cover story. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive haircut, and the kind of confident posture that comes from never having worried about money in your entire life. This was clearly her new husband, the one she'd left me for when my career hit that rough patch. After the formal presentation ended, Tiffany approached me with the kind of smile that politicians use when they're pretending to care about regular people. She extended her hand like we were old friends meeting at a country club, complete with their kisses and compliments about how wonderful I looked. The performance was truly spectacular. She started talking about how she'd always believed in my potential, how she'd always known I was destined for great things. According to this revised version of history, our divorce hadn't been her abandoning ship when things got tough. It had been her strategic way of giving me the space I needed to pursue my dreams. Her new husband joined the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spotted a promising investment opportunity. He started talking about their portfolio of successful ventures and how they'd love to discuss partnership opportunities with my new business interests. They even had ideas about how to monetize the discovery through licensing deals and media opportunities. I stood there listening to this performance, watching Tiffany rewrite our entire relationship history in real time, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. This was better than any comedy show I'd ever seen. The woman who had told me I was a failure with no prospects was now trying to convince me that she'd been my biggest supporter all along. But here's what struck me most about the whole surreal scene. I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no temptation to point out the obvious contradictions in her revisionist history. Looking at Tiffany and her husband, I realized they lived in a world where relationships were just another form of investment strategy, where loyalty was conditional on profit margins. When they finally paused their sales pitch long enough for me to respond, I did something that surprised even me. I thanked them politely for their interest and told them I wasn't looking for business partners at the moment. No drama, no accusations, no pointing out the obvious irony of the situation. Just a simple, clear decline. Tiffany's expression shifted through several stages of confusion. She clearly expected either anger or gratitude, not calm indifference. Her husband looked like someone who'd just been told that his sure-thing stock tip was actually worthless. They weren't used to people saying no to them, especially people they assumed would be desperate for their approval. As they walked away, probably to find someone else's success they could try to attach themselves to, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete confidence in my own judgment, the ability to recognize what was real and what was performance, the understanding that some things in life are more valuable than money, even really large amounts of money. Dr. Grant had watched this entire interaction from across the room, and when Tiffany and her husband finally left, she came over with an expression that was part amusement and part admiration. She'd witnessed my ex-wife's attempt to reinvent herself as my supportive partner, and she'd also seen how I'd handled it. That evening, after all the reporters had gone home and the museum officials had finished taking inventory of their new acquisitions, Dr. Grant and I found ourselves alone in her office, surrounded by copies of the documentation from our discovery. We'd been through an incredible journey together, from solving Dad's puzzle to becoming millionaires to navigating the weird world of sudden fame. But sitting there in the quiet aftermath of all the excitement, we started talking about what came next. We could retire, travel the world, buy whatever we wanted, and never work another day in our lives. Or we could do something more interesting with our newfound resources and expertise. That's when we came up with the idea that would define the rest of our lives. Miller Grant Artifact Consulting, a company that would specialize in historical research, authentication, and recovery of significant artifacts. We combined my engineering background with her academic expertise and the credibility that came from our discovery of Leo McGregor's cache. The business concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of just hunting for treasure, we'd approach historical mysteries with the same methodical research techniques that had led us to Leo's hiding place. We'd work with museums, universities, and legitimate collectors to solve historical puzzles and recover artifacts that had educational and cultural value. More importantly, we'd do it together. Somewhere between decoding astronomical calculations and crawling through underground passages, Dr. Grant and I had discovered something more valuable than any treasure. We'd found a partnership that worked on every level, professional, intellectual, and personal. 6 months after finding Leo McGregor's treasure, Dr. Grant and I were married in a small ceremony at the Oklahoma History Center, surrounded by the artifacts that had brought us together. It wasn't a traditional wedding venue, but then again, nothing about our relationship had been traditional. Our honeymoon was spent in Peru, working with archaeologists to authenticate a collection of pre-Columbian artifacts. Not exactly lying on a beach in Hawaii, but we were doing what we loved with the person we loved, which felt like its own kind of paradise. Miller Grant Artifact Consulting officially opened 6 months later, with our first major client being a museum in Boston that needed help tracking down Civil War artifacts that had been missing for decades. We were no longer just treasure hunters who'd gotten lucky. We were professionals with a proven track record and the resources to pursue projects that most people could only dream about. Sometimes I think about what Dad would say if he could see how his research had ultimately changed everything. Not just the money, though that was certainly life-changing, but the fact that his curiosity and persistence had led to something bigger than any of us had imagined. His mystery had become our mission, and his passion had become our profession.